You know, the ear is such a weird piece of geometry. It's so complicated and it's so not the point of the head. Like when you're painting a portrait, who cares about the ear? It matters that it's there, of course, but it's so overly complex for its own good. Now, we'll get into that complexity, don't worry. But overall, it is this, again, box-like sort of thing. It's got top planes, side planes, got a bottom plane, has some back planes. Essentially, that's mostly what you need to know for the ear, and we'll start simple. In fact, we'll see that rhythmically, if you can write the letter C, you can basically draw the ear. The ear is like a letter C, and we'll also find out how there are these little sub-C rhythms inside the ear as well. So we'll get into all that, and we'll also look at the critical part, which is where the ear attaches to the jaw. This angle is of critical importance. And that is a nice part about the ear in terms of its location. It kind of takes up where the jaw leaves off. Also, from front to back, it is located basically perfectly halfway between the front part of the head and the back part of the head. It's kind of that halfway point there. Anyway, it's a fun little quirky piece of geometry. Let's look into it. If you can write the letter C, you're on your way to being able to draw the ear. We just need to adjust the proportions of this letter C. So I'll undo that, and I'll chisel it out just a little more. Something like that, and then it tapers down in a long arch like this before flattening out right there. We're looking at this ear somewhere between 3/4 and straight on. One important feature about the ear is that this point and this point are not vertically connected. There is a diagonal here. That diagonal is the jaw, which is also not straight, but has a bit of a slant to it. You remember the angle of the jaw from a few chapters ago. I'm going to duplicate that diagram, just erase out the top of the letter C a little bit, make it a little bit more flat up here. Everyone's ear is shaped differently, but this is another common shape, a little flatter up top. I'm going to add yet another feature to it, and that is add a bit of thickness here, which tapers off and becomes thinner right around this point. I will then carry that line down the ear, but I will bring back the thickness down here, where the earlobe is. And now to draw that shape in perspective, looking at it like as if we're looking at the head front on, it would look something like this. And in this view, we still have a slight angle between the top and bottom of the ear. It's not a straight up and down thing. And then in perspective, I will just get that same sort of thickness, bring this down, widen it out for the earlobe. And already we basically have an ear. Not fully filled in yet, but that is identifiable as an ear at least. Again, a distorted letter C in perspective with some thickness. That's the ear. Of course, right now I'm keeping this interior part just flat. The planes kind of go like this, and there's some thickness here, right? The other characteristic of the ear that's important to know is that the top area sticks out further this way than the bottom area. So if we were to just shoot a direct line down, you can see that the top overhangs the bottom. You know, the ear is kind of rotated this way, just a little bit. And it goes without saying, mirrored on the other side of the head. I'm choosing a very pixelated picture for my example right now because even in a low-res example like this, the forms I just spelled out are what are apparent to us. That is, the overall C kind of shape of it. Notice the slight rotation that I just discussed. That is the top point overhanging the low point. Let's get this thickness, which tapers out into a thinner area of the ear, which continues down before getting thicker. And this guy has a larger earlobes, which is common for older folks. And we have this angled, not quite vertical connection to the jaw. In fact, if you wanted to connect this point to complete our geometry of the ear, it would be a very thin connection like that. But this is the part where we have to now deal with this inside of the ear. The inside of the ear is far less important than the overall shape and the overall forms that we just went over. Trust me when I say that nobody is going to look at your painting and say, I love everything except the inside of his ear. No one is ever going to say that. Now, if you miss the shape of the ear, yeah, you might be in some trouble. But when it comes to understanding the interior forms, let's just try and keep it simple. Accurate, but simple. Here's one of my favorite diagrams of the ear I ever received as a drawing student. This whole bent Y shape thing really stuck with me. It's just the letter Y, but bent at the stem. And what I like about that is the letter Y describes a flow, a rhythm, which is always how I love to understand the head, is rhythmically. The other thing about a bent Y shape is it kind of mirrors the C shape. You remember the C shape that we started with. Well, the bent Y shape is kind of just an interior C shape, except the interior C shape has a little fork in it, making it more of a Y. So let's reconstruct our ear from scratch. Doesn't take too long to just draw out these shapes. Get the thickness in here, tapering out to a thinner part. This thinner part maintains its thinness all the way down to the earlobe, where it will thicken out. Now, it can either thicken out down or it can thicken out up. Everyone's ears are different. Let's go down a little bit, just so it matches our diagram here. I always find it helpful to check my work with the angle of the jaw. It's very weird to draw an ear in isolation completely. Let's get some context for what it connects to. And okay, this bent Y shape. The thing I like to start with is the negative shape of the Y. That is, I like to draw this contour here. It seems to give me a sense for the positive shapes that are to come right now. So I start there. And the thing to note about the Y shape is that you need to leave behind a lot of room in here. That's why it's a bent Y shape, right? It bends out this way, so it leaves behind room in here. So when I draw that bent Y, I'll make sure I taper it out roughly like this. Probably need a little bit more thickness there. And we have something in the realm of that. Now it's always nice at this stage to fill in some underplanes. We have some thickness here, so the underside of that will often just be encased in shadow. And the negative space of our Y shape will usually be dark as well. And maybe some of these tight little planes in here will just recede into darkness, just for clarity in our diagram here. Okay, great. Now just to cross contour the Y shape a little more, there is some tricky little depth going on. Like, it's not just a flat plane like this. The Y shape itself has a bit of roundness to it. In fact, I'll just show you a photograph here. Here we go. So on this photo, you can see the sort of pitchfork of the Y, the stem bending. Again, everyone's ear is different, so the exact bend of this stem is different than the bend that I just drew, but the idea is that it's bent outward, forming that C shape. Now, the Y itself, you can see, has some depth to it. It's like a little mini mountain shape. It goes up and around. Then it dips down like a valley and comes back up, and that's consistent throughout. Let's now apply this to our diagram here. Coming up, dipping into the valley, coming back up, valley, back up. It's the same all the way down here. The earlobe is simply a wider mountain area. Cross contours, again, being a fantastic way of understanding the form without having to render it. You just kind of draw over the form with your pencil. And okay, so we're almost done here. We just got to tackle this area here, which we've been leaving blank. Folks who have had experience with piercing their ears probably are already familiar with the names of this area and this area. This is the tragus, and this is the antitragus. Like the septum before, a lot of people have their traguses pierced. However, let's start with the antitragus because it connects to our Y shape here. And all it is like this little speed bump kind of thing coming off the Y and a little bit of a bump. Then it takes a U-turn and does another little speed bump. So U-turn, speed bump, and we have the tragus. Almost like this little road mappy rhythm, like we're going on a little adventure here. Now the thing to note though is that the tragus lies just a little bit to the right of this part of the ear. So make sure we respect that in our diagram. The reason that's important is that the top of the ear, this part here, which currently just kind of ends in a blank spot, actually tucks under to the left of the tragus. This area just kind of feeds into a broader pool of darkness. I'll fill value in there in a second. Now, don't do this. Don't overlap the tragus like that. That's not correct. If anything, the tragus is in front of this part of the ear. The top of the ear just kind of goes like that just to connect to the rest of the head. You know, that area right in here, it just kind of forms this organic connection like that. And you can see the tragus is in front here as the top of the ear turns under. Very complex bit of form, but again, probably not going to have to deal with this that often. Just to wrap up our diagram here, I'll throw this part into shadow where the top of the ear is turning under. This can all just get a nice little bit of dark as it's a fairly recessed area. And we have a very nice looking ear now. And yeah, you know, this area in here, there's a little bit of depth to it, but I don't think I've ever painted that. Thinking about all the thousands of paintings I've ever done, I'm not sure I've ever had to paint that little mound, but it's there. And if you ever are painting a portrait of the ear, maybe you'll want to observe that. And while I'm on my little aside here, one of my favorite anatomical names is for this little spot here, the U-turn area. That is called the intertragic notch. So maybe I just earned you a few points in your next trivia game. Let's jump right into drawing some ears. I'll pull up some reference. I think probably the most common angle we see the ear from is this angle, which is looking straight on at the person's face. So we see the ear in a dramatically foreshortened view. And once again, the first thing I like to do is get the overall C shape, that inward slanting C shape, or maybe I should say the rotated outward C shape, observing that angle of the jaw. Then the next thing I always go for is that thickness, which tapers out into some thinness here. And I just kind of ballpark where the earlobe rests right in here. Now, instead of going to the bent Y shape on the interior, I find it more handy to get the rhythm between the antitragus and the tragus. The bent Y shape is going to come out somewhere around here, and her antitragus really comes out. We'll just do something like this. We get that U-turny rhythm. Now, this is in foreshortened perspective, right? So it's not nearly as dramatic as it was here. We get that U-turn, and then it goes into the tragus, which we know rests somewhere there. And while we're here, we can continue our top part of the ear down. We know it tucks into the ear right in there. The bent Y shape from this angle is pretty hidden. Like the bent Y is happening underneath this plane right in here. And the other characteristic about it is that when you see it in this perspective, it has a outward pointing trajectory. So when I go to draw it, you want that Y to come out a little bit. Again, everyone's different, especially in the ear. The ear is a lot of cartilage. It's entirely cartilage. There's no bone in the ear, so cartilage can really, really dramatically change from person to person, the shape of it, that is. I'm just seeing that big sweeping mountain shape here. And what I would do is just start throwing into shadow, you know, this area where the ear turns into itself here. Tucks under, I should say. These little tight planes around here get shadow. Maybe even underneath the earlobe there, a bit of shadow. And just for fun, even back here, a little bit of shadow, just to show the viewer, remind us, drawing this diagram, that these planes are behind. Maybe even as the ear starts turning under, we can throw that into a bit of value as well. I mean, if you wanted to show more of this Y, I don't see it on her because it's hidden, but I mean, you could do it. You could just kind of give yourself this sort of rhythm. If that ear looks a little too weird, you know, you can bring it back to the diagram we just drew earlier. Maybe this would look a little more aesthetically pleasing in a drawing. This is the same perspective we just saw, but the tragus-antitragus relationship is a little bit more clear here. Again, it's in severely foreshortened perspective, so when we get that little road bump for the antitragus, that U-turn happens very abruptly. It's very squished in space because of the perspective, coming back up, meeting the road bump for the tragus. And I do really love that rhythm. It's just one of those things that say ear. When a viewer sees that, it says, oh, that's an ear. It's a rhythm that's, you know, unique to the ear. The other thing about the tragus, when you see it from this angle, is that the tragus we're seeing pretty front on. We're kind of seeing its full width. And then as it bends backward to reach the antitragus, sometimes the antitragus can even be behind the tragus. So just be careful when you're drawing the ear when you're looking at the person from the front and you're drawing the ear in foreshortened perspective, that you're not flattening out the ear. And just to give you context, the ear lobe is actually down here, and we go up with that C shape. Yeah, so the antitragus we're seeing from the side. The tragus we're seeing kind of front on. You'll see me get to more ears in context when I do some painting demonstrations. For now, let's go ahead and move on.